Hello, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual event with Clare Sestanovich and Christine Smallwood to discuss Objects of Desire. Clare Sestanovich is an editor at The New Yorker. Her fiction has appeared in The New Yorker, The Paris Review, Harper's, and Electric Literature. She lives in Brooklyn. Christine Smallwood's debut novel, The Life of the Mind, was published in March of 2021. Her fiction has appeared in The Paris Review, N+1, and Vice. Her reviews, essays, and cultural reporting have been published in many magazines, including The New Yorker, Book Forum, T, The New York Times Style magazine, and The New York Times Magazine, where she is a contributing writer. She has also written the New Books column for Harper's Magazine, where she is a contributing editor and an editor at The Nation. She has a PhD in English from Columbia University, is a founding faculty member of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, and is a fellow at the New York Institute for the Humanities. So a little bit about our event tonight. Throughout tonight's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order copies of Objects of Desire by pressing the green button below. And that green button also takes you to our shop site where you can order Christine's book as well. We appreciate each and every order, of course, and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage.
Hi, can you hear me, Claire?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. So I just want to say I'm Christine and I'm here with Claire, and I'm so happy to be here. I think this book is so wonderful and I'm really excited to talk about it with you. And I wanted just to start tonight by giving people who haven't yet had the pleasure of reading the book just like a little taste of what it's about. So, I mean, Claire, do you want to tell us like what's your like sort of story of what the book is, or?
Sure. Yeah.
Great.
They're short stories. There are 11 of them. It's funny, like linked stories are very, I feel like, in vogue at the moment, and people are often like, oh, so are yours linked? And there's part of me that's always like, well, yeah, they are. But there is no, they're not linked in the conventional sense of you will see reoccurring characters or settings. But I do think of them as sort of emerging. I think they emerged out of a continuous mood and set of preoccupations for me. One thing that has been observed about the book is that the protagonists are almost all women, and they span, their age ranges span sort of from 20-somethings to 60-somethings, but I guess a couple kids sprinkled in there. And that wasn't by design, but I guess I'm interested in sort of the dissonance of women who are like very aware of their status as women, but not always in a sort of daily constant way, and sort of what they make of that disjuncture is interesting to me. So that crops up in a number of different ways in these stories. And yeah, I guess I think of all the characters in these books as being like extremely, but ambivalently and sometimes aimlessly like passionate people.
That's such a helpful and great way to start. I want to also read something to you that you said about the book that I think is really helpful. You said this in a press Q&A you did, and it says, these stories are about the before, the after, the almost. They're about the dizziness of anticipation, the hollowness of regret, the inescapable fact that when your body comes back to itself, you'll have to get to keep on living. So like a big question I have is about the mood of the book, right? I mean, this mood of the sort of like almost intimacy, or like the relationship that doesn't like quite ever happen, but it's kind of like built up and then it's lost, or it happens, but the happening isn't really the main event of the story. Is that mood, like what about that mood interests you? Do you feel like that mood is like what life is, or is that what a certain kind of stage of life is? Or like, how do you think about that as the overarching vibe of the collection?
Yeah, I guess we do have this stage of life that is defined by in-betweenness, and that's like adolescence, and we just sort of like bracket it and acknowledge it as this weird time of in-betweenness, out of controlness, not quiteness. And we have like the fear-mongering thing about the protracted adolescence that so many people are experiencing. And I'm not that interested in that argument, but I am interested in the way that ambivalent feeling and feeling of disappointment does really, I think, persist throughout life. And, you know, in my own experience, like conventional milestones just aren't a very good way. Sorry, we're experiencing someone else's milestone.
Yeah.
Just aren't that like reliable of a way of measuring life or mapping out like what it actually means to us and feels like to us. And, you know, I guess to think about what I was saying about passion, like there is a lot of these characters are really like longing for things, yearning for things, and that state, which I think of as being like it's really, if you experience it, which I think everybody does, it's like extremely definitional. But it's also this like, you know, to long for something is like in a linguistic sense, like not performative. It doesn't do anything. You just feel it, and it's supposed to be like the thing that precedes action. And yet it feels so much, I think, to us as individuals, like the action itself, because it's so intense.
Yeah.
So I think I'm trying to capture something of that. And it you know, it manifests in scenes that look ordinary, but from my own experience and from my efforts to like explore other interiorities, it just never feels ordinary.
And do you think that there's something about the short story as a form that makes it like a good like technology for getting at this kind of like longing, or this, I mean, again, you say it so beautifully, the like before, the after, the almost. Like it does seem to me like you picked the right form to take on this feeling.
I think that makes sense to me. I think short stories are like they're amenable to uncertainty in a way that I'm not totally sure what the novel's relationship to uncertainty is. I don't think it's like resistant to it, but I think something about the premise of like, you know, going into a short story that you're only going to be seeing glimpses of story. Like in a way, I think of the short story as being part of some larger story that like, it's not as if I know it and I've like plucked out the moments of it, but I'm very aware of the negative space of it all. And that feels, I think, important to rendering the like liminal space feeling. And I guess the other thing I think about a lot, and especially think about as I'm like trying to write a novel, is in short stories, like elision is part of the form. Like you get to leave stuff out, and you just have to leave a lot out. And there's I don't know, my experience is like the novel is much more intolerant of that. Like you can't just like neglect to explain that like somebody was, you know, raised in rural Nova Scotia or something like that is going to matter. And yeah, that's like learning how to, I think the problem with, or the elision is also the trick of the short story. Like you leave so much out and then you've got nothing. But I think when it works, and I don't exactly know how you know when it works, but it is that like the things that have fallen out somehow create in a way a more like, it's a cohesive whole, but a whole that like reminds you of the missing parts in evocative ways.
And when you were writing these stories, I'm sure there are 11 different answers to this question, but do you know the things that aren't on the page for us to know? Or do you also not know what's going to lie a bit? Yeah,
I would almost always, I don't know. I would say actually, unless I wrote it and removed it, which sometimes happens, I don't know. And I think that that's important to me. Like, I think if I knew, I would write it in this sort of like knowing way that wouldn't, I think some sense of the uncertainty would get lost. Or like, I don't want the feeling of like knowing more than characters or knowing more than readers. And maybe that's in part because like the writing process to me is largely like an inquisitive one. I don't know the ending, and I don't even know the like second half when I'm writing the first half. And I think part of what even just for me like keeps me writing it is thinking like, oh, I'm trying to find out these things myself.
So do you never write the ending first?
Never. Yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting because your endings are so beautiful. So I was wondering if maybe you had come up with some of them ahead of time.
No, in fact, I'm like really prone to writing past the end.
And then you cut back.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's like almost never. I just recently had the experience of like seeing it myself where I was like, oh, just going to get rid of that paragraph. And that felt like real growth because usually it's like an editor being like,
yeah, let's end on the up here. Yeah, that also though does seem like a classic short story editing thing. I mean, maybe when you're editing, do you do that to other people's work? You can kind of see where the end is.
Yeah, I mean, I never edit fiction, so I don't really, and I would be too scared, I think, too. Yeah. But yeah, I think it is a kind of classic narrative. You feel like you need to get it all out so that you can, I think so you can see it basically. And then you realize not everyone else needs to see it.
Yeah, I mean, I love the kind of ending that you do too, because it feels sometimes like it just catches you by surprise. You know what I mean? And like, you're like, oh my God, it's over now. Okay. And like, okay, that's enough about me. Can you read for us from the story? I think we're going to read from Old Hope, right? Okay.
Yeah, so this is from the beginning of a story called Old Hope, so no setup required. When I was about halfway between 20 and 30, I lived in a large rundown house that other people thought was romantic. There was a clawfoot tub with squeaky knobs and philodendrons that draped over the banisters. The door to my bedroom was at least 12 feet tall. I installed a coat rack over the top, and whenever I needed to retrieve a jacket or a towel, I stood on my desk chair, swiveling uncertainly. There were 6 of us in the house. We were all about the same age, and at some point during the summer, I'd moved in at the beginning of March, when the mornings were still cold, veins of ice glittering over the front steps. This became claustrophobic, unbearable. The house smelled of sweat and bike tires and something at the back of the oven being charred over and over again. 2 boys lived on the top floor and another lived in the basement. They weren't men, not really. I was aware of being surrounded. Shirtless, they cooked big vats of tomato sauce, the steam beating on their faces and clinging to the fur in their armpits. They smoked bongs they didn't clean and returned my books warped by bathwater. One afternoon, while a desk fan whirred near my cheek, I composed a long email to my high school English teacher because I remembered him as handsome in a remote way. The school had been large and impersonal, full of unkind sounds, the clang of lockers and the terrible screaming bell. But the English teacher wore expensive clothes and took an understated pleasure in saying inspiring things. In my head, he belonged at a prep school. My idea of prep schools came from outdated novels, a separate piece, that sort of thing. Later, at college, I learned that going to these schools entailed a lot of lacrosse and furtive blowjobs, and that, too, became a kind of romance in my head. I calculated that the English teacher was about 40, and then I pressed send. The email covered a lot of ground. I summarized what I called my college experience and devoted a long paragraph to The Artist's Way, the self-help book that I was using to structure my days. I described the cat outside my window, which I took the liberty of calling a feral cat. Toward the end of the email, I found myself saying that I couldn't understand the fear of death. Maybe it was a boy thing, the male ego. If death turned out to be anything other than pure oblivion, if the afterlife was even a little bit lucid, I would be disappointed. Wasn't everyone looking forward to the chance to actually, finally rest?
I really, really love this story, in part because it set me up to expect a very different kind of story. Like when I find out that a young woman is emailing her former older English teacher, I'm just like, okay, here we go. Here's like the Me Too story, and there's going to be some weird sex that happens between these 2 people. And no, like that is not at all what happens in this story. And instead, it's really a story about someone kind of realizing that they don't need a certain kind of authority figure in their life. I mean, I assume that you were intentionally trying to play with the reader's expectations.
Yeah. Your video has suddenly disappeared for me.
Oh no, really? Oh, I didn't do anything different.
Weird.
Christine, I think it's just your internet. So maybe
It's
we
just
can
my
just keep
internet.
talking and
Okay.
hopefully it'll
That's fine.
Okay.
Great. But that you were setting me up to have that, right?
Totally. Part of what's interesting to me is like, I think this narrator is a quintessential example of what I was talking about earlier, of this sort of like, you're back. The like stuck in a sort of like longing that's not really going anywhere. And this letter is, in my mind, it's sort of like the baby step toward the action that would like enact some feeling. So in a way, it's sort of this like risky thing that could, in fact, like propel us down the story that you just described that has like dramatic turns and something disastrous at the end. But it also is this like, I guess sort of like a safe form and a very private one, in spite of it being, there's this very good Janet Malcolm line that's all about like every letter you write is actually just like a letter to yourself. And there is something that I think that's kind of how it's operating for this character. And I mean, I leave open the possibility that she also thinks that like your story is the story we're headed for, and that's part of, we already know from this passage, she like likes to have romances in her head, and like there is an appeal to the possibility of the dramatic story unfurling, even as whatever it is about your own like narrative tendencies aren't going to let that happen.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's in this story that there's a line where the protagonist says something about how she's trying to figure out if she's the kind of like, if the things that she does are characteristic of who she is. And so this email thing seems to be like obviously that's what the emails are about, right? Her kind of testing the waters of what person she wants to be, or she's kind of discovering who she is.
Right. And I think she is like the meta narrative thing that's like part of her self-awareness, which to me makes her an appealing character, but also you sense is like her strength and her weakness, because if you're scrutinizing your own story so much, are you going to actually be the character in it? Maybe not.
Yeah. Well, so something we emailed a little bit about was about like the challenges of writing a story in which not a lot happens narratively, right?
Yeah.
And I think this story is a really good example of that, because you have these kind of emails that set you up for maybe like a meeting or a confrontation that doesn't then materialize. And then you also have another relationship that's going on in the story that also kind of like doesn't come to much, right? But like there is a drama there, and there is like tension that's resolved, but it's not explosive in any way. And so I just wonder if you have thoughts about like, what's it like to write a story like this, where you're kind of like really dealing more with tones and with anticipations than with actual conflict?
Yeah. I feel pretty clear when I'm writing that I'm not trying to write the explosive story. There certainly was a phase of like my writing life where I thought like, oh, I need to be like doing more plot diagrams. This is like not working out. And that just like isn't, it's a type of story I like to read, and it just isn't the one I'm trying to write. And so I think some of it is like trusting that these like moods that I'm trying to move through that feel satisfying to me, like if I'm moving through them in a way that like has an arc, that's going to feel rewarding to a reader. But there is always a moment of like, I initially didn't have in this story. So there's the English teacher, and there's also a friend of the narrator, this guy named Max, and he like was there, but he wasn't. Really wasn't doing that much. And I think I didn't realize that like, and I had like a whole separate tangent that was like about his girlfriend and her boyfriend. And we were like, there is a way that sometimes this type of story can like lead you, it can feel like it's permission to go down like whatever path you want, because you're just like moving intuitively and it's mood. So there is always a moment where I need to like restrain myself and be like, no, this actually isn't like Hannah's story. This is about these two people, and I actually do need to figure out what's happening between them. And the story like ends with this. I guess I'm a little wary of spoiler alerts, but I don't really believe in that with short stories. Anyway, it ends with this like surprising gesture, and it felt to me like it was the necessary kind of, I guess, counterweight to these letters, which are in some sense like totally non-physical bids for connection.
Yeah.
And having the sort of B plot be not necessarily like more explosive or more dramatic, but be kind of like exploring the separate, like very physically driven connection between two people. Physically driven is maybe wrong, but like it has a physicality.
Yeah.
So I think it's more about, I think maybe I'm not answering your question, but it's about like balancing the, like, there are a lot of characters in this book that have a ton going on in their heads. And if the story only happened in their heads, we would feel like, I think, 2 levels too removed from them.
Yeah.
So it is finding like, even if you're stuck and like you're feeling lost, you are in the physical world, and there's like something interesting that we can say about that.
Yeah.
I do think that's part of where like descriptive language, like physical sensations, like all these things provide some sort of ballast in the stories, or I hope they do.
No, I think that's exactly right. There's I mean, what impresses me about short stories is just, I mean, and people who are very good at writing them like you, is that everything is so perfectly calibrated, right? So you have, it's just what you're saying, you have a kind of mood, and just before it tips into being too abstract, there's like one totally explosive, like really perfect detail. And I think that this book is like kind of shockingly filled with like perfect images and like really incredibly like indelible descriptive language. Like, I was just like flipping through it before we started, and there's like these tea bags that look like the dead shells of cicadas, and it's just like, I mean, that really blows me away. And then there's one, it's like somebody's describing a fetus as being kind of like thin and milky, like a hard-boiled egg. I mean, it's just, the language is really quite exquisite. And I wonder, like, does that come naturally to you? Like when you sit down, is that just like how you see the world, or are you working at those moments? And like, what does that work like?
I think for better, for worse, at some point in the course of like learning to write, I did like internalize the, Jamesian edict to be the person on whom nothing is lost, or like that was like, that's what a literary sensibility was. And I think that actually, I'm not totally convinced that is the like high bar of prosaic achievement or something. Like it's cool when there are blind spots in novels or stories and you can talk about those. But I guess I think, well, there's 2 things. One is that like to be observational and like it is a skill you can practice. And I think there was a point in writing where I was like, this is elusive, this is unteachable, like an unlearnable, I don't know how to do this. And actually like to focus on the like refinement and attunement of like how you see the world is something you can train yourself to do. And then, train yourself, and you can get better at it for sure. Mm-hmm. And then I guess it is like, I do find it really pleasurable, and like the being able to put an image or a sensation into words is, it's like so satisfying when you can do it. And there is like, in my experience, a kind of positive feedback loop where, you look at things differently so that you can describe them differently and better. And then in turn, like the act of description is also changing the act of perception. So is this like, I find that just like very rewarding. And I'm like, I used to, when I had like more time, I had a whole separate like document where I was exclusively, the rule was like, you can only write images. And you can't write a story idea. There's no like plot, there's no premise. You put the thing that you saw in there.
Yeah. And what do you, like when you're reading a story or a book or whatever, a novel, and you come across a really beautiful or exquisite image, like, does it stop you in your reading? Like, what happens in your mind? Do you actually like see the pictures in your mind? Do you take the time to see them?
Yeah, I'm super visual. I can't, like, if people read things aloud to me, can't see it at all. But if I have the book in front of me, it is, and like when I was young, I used to, if I didn't like the way, this happened a lot with historical fiction, where if I didn't like the way that a character was like dressed in appropriate period dress, I would just like, I would put the book aside and spend some time like redressing them and then return to the book. So I do, like, the visual element is like so cool. I can't really imagine reading it without it. And as I'm writing, I'm doing that too. Or like, yeah.
No, please go on. This is actually totally fascinating.
A good example of this is the other day I was like trying to describe the there was a bird in the story I was writing, and I wanted to describe the particular sound of the bird outside. They're always outside on my fire escape. But I'm pretty tone deaf, so I like couldn't figure out, like, is that ascending? Is it just like, how is the tonality working? And I spent like 30 minutes on YouTube, like watching bird cams, and got to this like extremely serendipitous moment where the sound coming out of my computer was the same as the sound coming through the window. Wow. And it was like, anybody else would have been able to recognize this bird. It's like a mourning dove, and it has this very classic coo, but I couldn't identify it at all. And then, I've like done all this in the service of describing one sound. So then I'm like, oh, maybe this is actually like, maybe this is a scene, and, or maybe it's not, but there is a way that like the labor that's involved in like minute description, I think to me always feels, it's never a sunk cost, because it sort of like opens up into so much else, at least in like the image that becomes the scene or the character or the problem. Like, I think for me, that always is the gateway to what it is I'm writing about.
So like what, I mean, not to get, but like, what does description mean to you? Is it about fidelity to the world? Is it about realism? Is it about like the beauty of language? Like what happens if you are someone on whom things are lost? Like, why is it so important to describe things? And I don't even know what word to use here. Is it describing them fully, or describing them well, or describing them like memorably? Like, I don't, because like describing the skin of a fetus as being kind of like an egg, like, is that description like faithful to what it really is, or does it carry a different kind of meaning? I'm so fascinated by, like, I guess I also want to just sort of like comment that for me, what description is also doing in your stories is kind of like stopping them a little bit and like slowing them down, because you kind of want to go back and read it again. And that's really kind of good in a story, because sometimes a story can actually, I think, move too fast, and then you're just kind of like, oh, it's just kind of over. And then description can actually be like a way that we can kind of slow things down.
Yeah, that sounds very right to me. I mean, I think that there is a way that when I'm writing, at least when I'm writing like a first draft or something, I basically have to not think too hard about like, is the fetus as hard-boiled egg gonna work for everyone else? I basically have to just think like, is it working for me in this moment? And is it like, and I can't exactly describe what the litmus test is, except that like, I will go through a lot of wrong descriptions before something clicks. And I think it has to do with like, both, is it like evoking something, credibly and with like more specificity than you would like normally discern in the thing, but also is it like fitting with the larger sensibility of the story? Like, does it make sense? I do feel that I'm not describing everything, and I want there to be a purpose to the like I can't, it needs to fit thematically or characteristically.
Yeah.
It's a little hard to say. But I also think it's part of what I do want to be replicating for readers is brief immersion in somebody else's life. And I think the best way that I know how to do that is to feel that you are like seeing what they're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels to me like the strangest sort of like ethical proposition of fiction that you can presume to see as somebody else or in the life of somebody else. And so I think like the fidelity to those details, not as they would exist per se in my world, but in their world, feels like it's the only way I can do it honestly, or like, or presume to ask other people to suspend their disbelief and enter this world.
So, I mean, I guess we should pivot a little to talk about like one thing that gets described in your work in an interesting way, which is the body, right? And because I know you talked about this a little bit in your other events, but like, I feel like sometimes like maybe the way I'm talking about the book makes it sound like it's really like lyrical. And like there is something lyrical about it, but there's also then like, there'll just be like a kind of, oh, here's a bloody tampon, or like there's a ton of stuff about like reproduction or like stalled reproduction and like particularly like the female body and sex and desire, but also other kinds of ways that the female body shows up. And I mean, I don't know, is this something that you were doing on purpose? Did it just kind of, this is where your interests kind of took you, or like when you sat down to then kind of like edit the book as a whole, how were you thinking about what the bodies were up to?
Yeah. I think it does feel like another piece of the sort of physical world that we have to know about if we're going to inhabit these characters' lives. And it feels, I guess I'm interested in the ways that both as people and as writers, like that physical element can feel to us ignorable. And, you know, there's the scene that we were talking about before that involves this narrator who is sort of in a phase that I think we could think of as like arrested development. And a number of the characters in this book do feel that way and have some sensation of like other people are going on without them, or like they've been left behind, or they've abandoned something, but in turn it feels like actually the thing has abandoned them. And I think in those moments, the body does become basically a remind. I mean, it's not even like a memento mori in the sense that it's a reminder of our mortality. It just like is our mortality. And I think the way that it functions as a reminder of time for us is really important and is something I'm interested in. And, you know, so there's a story in which the character gets her period while she's babysitting this girl. And she has felt, I think, this identification, like an over-identification with the child in the story. And, you know, and like her period's been irregular, it's been weird. And in some ways, this is like a sign that everything is proceeding as normal. And there's also a way that like that's the last thing she wants is like things are proceeding as normal. And so I think the body does kind of like, on the one hand, it can be this symbol of stagnancy because we're trapped in it and there's nothing you can ever do to get out of it. You know, you have your period, you're bleeding, it's messy, whatever. Nothing you can do about that. And it also at the same time is, I think, the best symbol we have of like continuity and progress, and the ways that those two things really clash for the characters feels interesting. And I kind of like don't know a better way to explain that, like how much of a clash it feels like.
Well, you have one story where there's a character who's a painter, and we find out late in the story that literally her artwork is like integrates her hair. Like she's painted these canvases and they're very thick with paint, and she paints over her failed canvases. And then we realize that like actually there's like parts of her body that are like hidden inside the work, but like peeking out. And that just feels to me like such a great like image for what your book is doing with its bodies.
Yeah, I like that. And I mean, I think, you know, in that story, there is people react to the paintings as like, oh, this is weird. And there is, it's so odd that like, in a way we think of like our bodily functions and desires as being like our most elemental and authentic, and like our bodies are our superficialness and our depth. And yet there's also a way that we like turn away from all of that as well. And like to see it rendered so blatantly on like a canvas or in a book, you can think like, that's not the authenticity I want. Although so many other like modes of our life, we accept that that is like the body tells the truth, kind of.
Right. Okay, I'm going to take a question from the question box, and if people want to add questions in, please do. Okay, this is a question. Performance is a big theme in the collection. Can you talk a little bit about that? Talk about performance.
Yeah. Here we are.
Perform.
It's a preoccupation of mine, and I think it's a preoccupation of basically all the characters. And part of it is about, like, as we've said, these are characters who haven't really figured out what they're up to or like who they are. Performance is both, I think, like a necessary experiment that all of us are engaged in. And it's like something that can be perceived as like fraud and self-delusion or deception of others. And I'm so fascinated by all that blurriness because I don't think it's always clear like which it is. And maybe sometimes it's both. And, you know, one sort of like more concrete way that this shows up in the stories is like there are a number of characters who like have a bunch of different jobs. And there's one story in which a character who has like is at loose ends has an artist friend who's like, oh, you can cobble things together. Like that's how we do it. And she has this sort of reaction of like, oh, I don't know if I'm like entitled to that way of doing things. And I think it is because she's like, I don't have the, you know, grounded center that will allow me to like go out and be a lot of different things. And I do think, I mean, in some ways when it comes to work, I think that's like it's a sort of like Western bias that you can't like put on a lot of different hats and just like, you know, there has to be some driving moral compass or like true self. And so, yeah, I am just like very curious about how like the multiplicity of self functions for people. Cause I think we're all like countless people and, you know, like our lives are stories about figuring out which character we're going to be.
Oh yeah, that's so well said. I totally agree. Here's another question. Can you tell us about the narrative techniques in your novel?
Yeah. You know, technique. I don't know, I guess. Maybe I can't answer the question. It's, you know, whenever I'm writing very like intuitively. So there's first person stories here, there's third person stories. There is one second person direct address, which is like the type of thing that in workshops I was always told never to do. And so I think, and I did it because it felt to me like, well, I wasn't justifying it to myself at the time that I did it, but afterwards I was like, can I justify this? And ultimately decided that I could. So a lot of it is, I guess like we'll begin with an experiment that is about trying to discern whether the like technique is ultimately going to fit with content.
I have another question, which is just, is not connected to anything we've been talking about, but it's a question about phones. I mean, I think this is such a problem for if you're writing today and your story or your book is set today, like you just kind of have to deal with the phone, right? The cell phone. And you do, like, there are points in your stories where people, and there's actually, like, I think an image that comes up a couple times about having like the world in your pocket, or having things in your pocket, which is like really, really nicely said. But none of your characters are like obsessed with being on their phones all the time. And I wonder, like, if that was a choice you made because you were just like, if I go down that road, then like that's what the whole book is going to be about, and like I just don't, or just how did you think about that?
Wow, that's a great question. I think it was a little bit of just aversion of like, I haven't figured out like how I want to do, like, if I'm going to have a long text exchange, what do I want that to look like? That feels to me like this huge, huge question. And not one that I have like stable opinions about. Like, I've read books where like seeing G-chats written out is like repellent to me. And then in other books, I'm like, oh, I like this. Like, this is really, I'm in the swim of things. And so it feels, I think, so easy to make. I guess weirdly what it is like phones are they're like the water, the internet is the water we swim in. And so in some ways it's like, should be effortless to mix into the novel or fiction. But I think because like writing is a technology itself, there's something that does feel like I'm always worried the mixing of the technologies will bring people out of the world. And so it's something I just don't really have a fix for. And, you know, like the story that I read from is about emails and that, but like, to be honest, it could have been letters, and like that, like right now I'm writing a novel that's partly epistolary, and that's like, I'm curious now that you asked this question, I'm wondering like, oh, am I doing it that way because I'm sort of like trying to dodge this hyper connectivity thing, or not like dodge it, but like figure out what communication looks like without.
I mean, as a reader of these characters in this wonderful book that everyone here should buy, I did feel sometimes like part of what made these people special and different was that they were not checking their phones all the time, right? Like, and like and part of like, there was like a certain flavor to their like longing and their sense of in-betweenness because they weren't like doing the most familiar thing, which is just being like, take me out of where I am, right? And it's also like, especially, you know, for a writer like you who's very observant of the physical world, the phone is just this whole other thing. It's like a whole other place, really, that we go to instead of being in the place that we are.
Right. And I think, as you were saying that, a thing that occurred to me is like, at least the way I use my phone and the internet, it's very compulsive in a way that I think is often by design, like a distraction from like longing and uncertainty. And like, it's even, you know, and I mean that in the mundane way of like, I am among the many people who like can no longer wait for 5 minutes for the bathroom line without like scrolling. And I do think there is like part of why I'm not having people scroll is that like, I really want to observe them, like sitting in, as we say, or sitting with the like uncertainty and the like, the bad, ugly feelings. And it's there's a way, I know you could put a phone in the story in a way that wouldn't do that, but I'm so accustomed to it being like the crutch that lets us ignore all that, that it's.
Yeah, I mean, it totally makes sense to me. And I mean, I think it totally like works. And this isn't like a criticism. It's just like, there's just like a mood, right? That the phone would kind of destroy actually in the stories. And yeah, so there was a follow-up question about that just said, do you think technology can date a work of fiction by trapping it in the period that it's written?
I mean, I'm so fascinated to know, like, what are we going to make of all the G-chatting in 2 decades? I don't think it's going to, I mean, yes, of course it will date it. I think that will be like anthropologically interesting for lots of readers. So I don't think it like becomes you know, in some ways I'm almost like, I don't want to read any of the internet novels until we've gotten past it, because then it will be a sort of like I'll be reading it nostalgically, and I will have some appreciation for how, well, I'll be reading it nostalgically, but also it like won't hit as close to home, I expect. There is something about the ways that right now technology and fiction just like holds up a mirror and shows us our very ugly images. So
yeah, totally. Okay, well, I think we're supposed to end soon. Is there anything else that you wanted to, I mean, I have like a zillion questions that we didn't actually get to talk about. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about, or any last questions anybody wants to put in the question box? No? What do you think, Claire? Oh, we're back.
Well, I always love to ask you guys what you're reading. You know, as a bookstore, we love book recs. So if you guys could give your current read or anything that you're recommending right now, I'm sure we all love to add it to our TBR.
Yeah. I'll go. The book that I'm most excited to start reading is the short story collection by Tilly Olson called Tell Me a Riddle. And I hope it's still in print. Maybe not. I think, well, anyway. And then because I'm really excited, I was excited to learn the other day that Claire Louise Bennett has a new book coming out soon. And so I just wanted to plug her old book, which is called Pond, and I think it's a book that I was thinking of while I was thinking about like characters who are stuck, and it's great.
Of course, I totally see the resonances there. Yeah. Do you want me to go also, or no? Oh, okay. I just started reading Chilly Scenes of Winter by Anne Beattie. Have you read that, Claire?
No. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm only a few chapters in.
All right, well, that was great. Thank you so much. What a wonderful conversation. And of course, thank you to everyone in the audience who joined us tonight. We really appreciate it. And if you have not ordered your copy of Objects of Desire, you can do so by clicking, there it is, by clicking the green button below the screen. So thank you, Christine. Thank you so much, Claire. And hopefully we'll see you at our next virtual event.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.